Hi everyone, it's me, Arden Lee, and in this video, we're going to be talking about how do we forgive ourselves for our past mistakes, for our past lack of discernment, perhaps lack of discretion, for oversharing, for ignoring our own personal boundaries, or perhaps even trespassing other people's personal boundaries. And this is an important question. It's asked by one of the members of the Repatterning Parlor, which, by the way, is the group that I moderate on Facebook. So if you're not yet a member, go ahead and check out the link that is in the description box. Come join us and say hi. And you can also submit your questions to be answered in these videos too. So come over, we'd love to see you. I'm grateful that this question was asked because this really gets at much of the heart of why I created the Repatterning Project in the first place. When I was on my own journey of trauma healing, and it was only a little ways into that journey that I realized that I had trauma and that I realized what I was doing was healing trauma. So I'll put that out there too. But the reason that I created this, that I wanted to share this information, is because in understanding how our biological systems operate, we have an understanding that in those moments when we've made mistakes, in so many instances, I would say the vast overwhelming majority of those instances, we're really doing the best with what we have. And we're born into these bodies that know biological ways of coping that don't always mesh with our best interests, even though our bodies are trying their best to protect us. Understanding what our bodies are doing and the ways that they're creating survival coping mechanisms in order to protect us gives us some control over them. Before we understand that, it's impossible to expect ourselves to adhere to a standard that is beyond what our bodies understand and what they're doing in order to be able to protect us, right? So let's talk, for example, about some survival mechanisms, right? Let's talk about the instance, for example, in which a survivor of a sexual assault might make breakfast the next morning for the person who assaulted them. How could that possibly make sense, right? So many of us would say logically, like, well, if you were upset by it, if they did something you didn't like, why didn't you just kick them out, right? Well, one of our trauma responses, one of about 4 or 5 potential trauma responses that people discuss nowadays, is the fawn response. And the fawn response is a biological mechanism by which we try to be pleasing to either the people who have harmed us so that we can create more safety, right? It's like, oh, I'll be nice to you, you won't hurt me, right? If I perceive that you're a threat, but if I make you an omelet, like, how could you possibly, like, get in a fight with me or whatever? Like, maybe we can leave things peacefully, and then I'm gonna go and cope with my trauma afterwards, right? Or sometimes we might fawn to people who we perceive as being able to save us, right? Well, why did I kiss up to this person in particular, right? Well, maybe and this person maybe was like, I've had instances in my past where I've had fawn responses where I chose the person who was the lesser of two evils, and that still might not have been a good choice for me, but it was like the better choice, right? Wow, like this person seems super dangerous, so I'm gonna ally myself with this person who feels slightly less dangerous, even though they're still overall like kind of a dangerous person, and that it's not helpful for me. One of the things that we learn about in the Repatterning Project is we learn about these trauma responses, but we also learn about something called learned helplessness, right? Learned helplessness is this idea that if we are subjected to abuse over and over again in a context where we can't leave, right, which is subjective, the ability to leave is a pretty nuanced discussion, first and foremost. But let's put it this way, right? If you're subjected to harm over and over again in an environment where you can't leave, then if you're in an environment or suddenly an opportunity for you to leave, that environment presents itself, or you're in an environment where you maybe can leave technically, you may still not leave. And I'll tell you how they discovered this. This is kind of a sad story. It has some sort of, animal abuse involved. It's not really a very ethical study in my opinion, but it did create this information. So what happened is a team of scientists took some dogs and they put some dogs in some cages, and they would administer electroshocks to the dogs while they were in the cages. And what they found is that if you shock a dog when the cage door is open, the dog will leave the cage, right? Ow, I don't want to be here, you're shocking me, I'm going to go. But if you put a dog in a cage and you close the door and you shock it over and over again, and then eventually you open the door and you shock the dog again, the dog won't leave the cage. So what is the dog cage in our metaphor, in our human metaphor? Our personal dog cages are ages 0 to 18 when we are legally bound to our parents. Some people may be able to emancipate themselves. I tried and I failed. So I tried to leave the cage, and not only could I not leave the cage, but I was like shoved back in it, and the metaphorical electroshocks got a lot worse naturally because I had tried to leave. So what happens is we'll be in these environments, we'll learn helplessness, right? We'll learn that we can't leave even when situations change and the door opens, right? Now we're 18, right? Now we're legally adults. Now we can do what we want to do, but we're used to this helpless response. This has been programmed into us. So we might get into a relationship and we might not leave that relationship because it still feels like we can't leave, because we've conditioned that helplessness response. We've had that helplessness response conditioned into us by the fact that we were in a situation where we couldn't leave before, right? It's going to happen in abusive relationships too, right? Let's say maybe you had a super normal childhood, but then you get into a relationship where for some reason or another you feel like you can't leave. Maybe you have too many friends in common. Maybe you feel like you wouldn't have the ability to start your life over without this person. Maybe you're financially dependent on them. Whatever that circumstance is, eventually there may be a time where technically you could leave, but you might still feel like you can't, right? So this is just one example, right? The Repatterning Project teaches more and more comprehensive views of how our human operating system works in these regards, right? We want to understand our natural biological responses, because when we understand our natural biological responses, we can forgive ourselves for the choices we made. For a long time, I didn't think that I had trauma because I technically could have left. I technically could have, I technically could have walked out of this environment at any time. However, there were factors that were keeping me there. There were certain traumas that were keeping me there. There were certain fears that were keeping me there. Certain dependencies that were keeping me there. And for a long time, I was like, well, that couldn't have been traumatic to me because I kept going back. And when I read about learned helplessness, I understood that a lot better, and I was able to forgive myself. So the key to self-forgiveness is, in my opinion, understanding that our bodies are always doing the best that they can at that time. And we look at times where maybe we overshared, right? Well, we were looking for something to process. We were looking for help in whatever, maybe ways that may have been misguided, right? I've overshared with people too before. I've trusted the wrong people who went and used that information against me in the future, and I've regretted that. I've definitely paid for that. But what am I gonna do? I was doing the best that I could at the time, and being able to look at that and understand it, and ultimately create that understanding of what our bodies are doing, how our bodies are protecting ourselves, allows us to go and look at our former self and say, thank you. You were doing the best that you could at the time with everything that you were given. We know now better better ways of coping so we can move forward and make different choices in the future. But it allows us to give ourselves that forgiveness, especially for those of us who have trauma. You guys, those of us who have trauma, we're not going to respond in perfect ways. There's no such thing as the perfect victim, the perfect survivor, etc. There are so many reasons why people might react or respond in different ways when they are either suffering trauma or stuck within a desensitized or hyper aroused trauma response, right? It's our responsibility to do our best to move forward and to heal ourselves and to learn all we can so that we can create in our bodies the intention of always showing up at our best and showing up with an integrity and learning from our mistakes and moving forward. But self-forgiveness is a big part of that. There was someone who, when I was in the BDSM scene, this might be a little bit of a weird metaphor, but when I was in the BDSM scene, someone once told me this story of, they had forgotten something. They were in a dominant submissive relationship, and the submissive had forgotten something. They were at the airport, and she was, carrying a suitcase, and she was like beating herself up for forgetting something important that her dominant had wanted or something like that. And her dom noticed that she was still, beating herself up over this mistake. And he said to her, "How dare you waste my time on something that's in the past?" And she was like, "Oh, now it's a little harsh, right?" That's a DS relationship. So if they're into that sort of, that dialogue, I'm not going to judge that. But I often think of that sort of same thing as coming from my own higher self. When I'm beating myself up for my past mistakes, I often imagine my higher self saying, "Arden, how dare you waste our time? We have things in front of us that we could be doing. Did you learn from that mistake? Have you integrated the changes? Do you understand it? Are you finished with your processing around it now? Are you ready to move forward? Great. Then let's move forward. Don't waste my time. We have work to do." So self-forgiveness is important to being able to step into our highest selves, right? Isn't that funny how I have a way of guilting myself into forgiving myself? but whatever works, really. And for me, I understand that forgiving myself is key to showing up as my best self today. I'm not going to get anywhere and make any improvements if I keep harping on things that I did in the past. I learn from them, I integrate the knowledge, and I move forward. So I hope this is helpful. I'll see you guys soon.